Are you tired of landscape master materials always being a chaotic spaghetti that are chore to modify? That adding or removing landscape layers mean that you need to spend an hour manually reworking the master material, or that the material instance is a cluttered mess? If the answer is yes, well, I have an exciting news for you. I've created Ultra Modular Landscape for people like you, and in this video, I will show you how you can create stunning landscapes with it. In only a matter of minutes, we will create this Icelandic scene from absolutely scratch, creating new landscape material layers and spawning complete mountains with only a couple of clicks. Alright, let's start with creating the new landscape. If you are planning to use UML's prefab system, it's best to keep the component number under 256 or even lower if you want a responsive experience. We will use 64 for this demo. Let's create a new material instance using the master material and then apply it to the landscape. Let's talk about the landscape paint layers. As default, there are 5 standard and a few technical layers. Keep in mind that the layers that are not enabled in the material instance are not calculated with and don't cost any performance. The reason we have only 5 layers as default is just to keep it cleaner and easier to organize. If you want more layers, you can have up to 12 editable ones. Just open up the master material and create a new layer sample and plug it into the appropriate bin. Don't forget to compile the master material and then reapply the same material instance. Also, as you can see, layer order doesn't matter here, so feel free to reorganize them as you wish. Let's create the layer info files. It's best to use the non-weight blended option because that's the most accurate, and the other one might introduce some blending issues later on. Create these for all the layers you are planning to use. Now, don't worry about the other ones. If you decide later to use them, you can just come back here and set them up. Let's open up the material instance. As you can see, the details panel is pretty empty. That's because we have only the global parameters here that affect the whole material and not just a single layer. If we want to work with the layers, we need to switch to the Layer Parameters tab. Here you will find all the parameters affecting a single layer. So the background layer is basically layer 1 for us. Let's make it a grassy one. Since we have a channel packed roughness and occlusion map, we need to pick the appropriate channel for the roughness, which is the green one. Let's create a 1 meter cube for scaling reference. Then open up the tiling submenu. You will find all the scale and tiling related options here. Change the scale to 1.5. But with a plane like this, visible repetition is quite an issue. So let's enable distant textures, which is a secondary distant version of the texture. The default 0.25 scale offset means that it's 4 times bigger than the close version. Usually this is enough, but for such a big plane, you might need to enable the texture variation, both for the close and the distant texture. This is a really cool feature. It basically makes the UV randomly rotate and scale, which breaks up all repeating patterns. Let's tweak the colors a bit. Make it a bit brighter, with a bit less contrast. Making a bit more green and some extra tint to fit better the lush Icelandic mossy ground. We can also enable the macro detail overlay, which is a cool feature for extra details in the distance or an alternative option for breaking up the tiling patterns. We can also overlay the ambient occlusion over the base color to achieve some extra shadow definitions. Alright, so we have one layer, but here goes the cool part that makes UML unique. Just press the plus sign next to the material layers, name the new layer as you wish, it doesn't matter. Let's call it gravel. Open up and find UML's layer asset. Just drop it into the layer asset part and the layer blend beneath it. Or if you don't want to search in the content browser, you can just click on the asset and search for UML. It will show any appropriate file types. And that's it. We have a brand new layer completely independent from the previous one, with all the same functionalities, using the same material function. So if you want to modify, add new features, for example, you just modify the single layer asset. Head over to the blend assets submenu, and in the layer switch section you need to pick which layer this really is. It doesn't matter how you name the layer, it's purely for organization. It also doesn't matter what the layer order is here or in the landscape pane tab. This setting is the only thing that matters, so make sure to enable the correct one. Another awesome feature of having modular layers is that you can save all your settings and parameters as separate layer assets. Just click the Save Chat button, give it a name, do some random change, and if you load the saved asset in here, it should all revert back to the original. Now you can do changes here, which will be visible only for this material, or open up the saved asset. And if you change here, it will delegate to all other materials using this asset. All right, the next important step is setting up how this layer is blended on top of the previous one. This is controlled by the separate blend asset. Let's scroll down, and in the blending tweak section, enable the height mix option, which makes this layer appear more where it is higher on its height map and less where it is lower. If you want to increase or decrease the strength of this effect, change the height texture contrast parameter. Alright, let's finalize this material. I actually wanted something smaller for this gravel layer, so I will just replace this with another one that I've saved previously. And we will create two more layers, a rocky grass and a cliff layer. I will use a couple of saved ones for these as well. Make sure to pick the correct layer switch option for each layer and enable height mixing if you're using the default UML layer blend asset. And as mentioned before, even if you started with a saved asset, you can just expand the parameters and tweak them or modify them anytime later on. Okay, now that we have a basic material setup, let's start with the fun part and spawn some mountains. If you open up UML's prefab folder, you will find 16 different mountain shapes and some example preset for each. Just grab one of them and drag and drop on your landscape. Doing this for the first time, this pop-up will appear saying that you are creating a new landscape sculpted layer. Just click accept. And that's it. You have a full mountain that can be scaled and rotated. If the mountain doesn't appear for you, make sure that you have the landscape patch plugin enabled. These prefab presets are just examples. They are starting points for you, but you can rework them completely. In the textures folder, you will find 16 mountain shapes with 20 different erosion maps for each of them. Let's focus back on our material. As we can see, our layers aren't looking the best yet, so let's disable the extra layer paints on this mountain and check them one by one. Keep the first element, which is layer 2 in our case. Open up the material. Start tweaking the blending settings. For example, the height map contrast might be a bit too strong. This looks better now, but You can see some quite visible repeating patterns, so I will head back up to the tiling section and enable texture variations. This is looking much better now. We should check the next layer, which is layer 3 in our case. There doesn't seem to be much going on with this layer, so let's open up the material and in the blend asset section, lower the height map contrast and give the weight painting a little boost. Yep, that's a little too much, so dial that back a bit. That should do it. Now the blending looks better, but I'm not too happy about the erosion mask we're using, so let's just replace to something else. That looks much better. Head over to the next layer, which is layer 4, as a cliff layer in our case. We'll change the tiling a bit and enable distant texture, so we have a nice detailed texture from the distance as well. Check the blending, and of course I forgot to enable height mixing, and that's already looking much better. I think the rocky grass might be a bit too big from up close, so I will increase its scale. This looks better, but now I don't like it as much from the distance. There isn't as much visible repetition, but the blending looks uniform, so we could try enabling the distant texture option. Getting there, but now as the camera approaches the ground, the switch is too obvious between the two textures, because the mask used for the blending also fades between the two. We can fix this by disabling the distance fade option here. With this, we can use only one of the high textures, either the distant or the close one. It's usually best to use the distant one. Also in the distance, I see some steep slopes where this layer started to show some stretching. We can fix that with enabling the triplanar projection option. Now that you know the basics, we can start populating the whole landscape with mountains. You can either drag and drop example prefabs from the content browser or just duplicate an existing mountain and replace its textures. When you combine multiple mountains, there are different blending options for both the high texture and the paint layers. This is already starting to look quite nice. I'm happy with these mountains for now, but the far distance looks a bit empty, so I will put some static meshes into the background. You can find the static mesh version of each mountain in the meshes folder. These are perfect for this purpose. And the cool thing is that you can use the same material for the static meshes that you have set up for the landscape. Duplicate the material instance and then replace its parent to the static mesh variant of UML's master material. Enable the layers that you want to use, the same ones that you are using with the landscape material, and then just find some erosion mask that you like. We can edit the material layers here, same as with the landscape version, so I will tweak the texture scales to look better from the distance. Alright, I think this scene could use some extra snow, so let's make a new layer. If we want the prefab mountain to create snow, we need to set up a new paint layer element there as well. Make sure to set the layer name layer_5, as that's what we used in the blend asset in the snow material layer. We can pick a nice erosion map that fits the snow. And repeat the same on a couple of other mountains as well. We can also do this on the background mountains. So let's open up its material, create a new layer, exactly the same as with the landscape. In the next bits, I will show you a couple of advanced material features, starting with fuzzy shading that will apply to the grass layer. This makes the landscape shapes and curves more pronounced, especially in the shadowed areas. The next feature is gradient coloring. With this, you can recolor any layer using a grayscale mask and a color curve. For this to work, we will need to create a new landscape paint layer called gradient mask. Then click on a prefab mountain and add the new paint layer, also called gradient mask. Now, if you add an erosion texture or basically any grayscale texture, this will drive the color curve gradient. If you open up the curve asset, the bottom scale going from 0 to 1 means black and white values on our erosion texture. You can assign color to each value with the color handles on the top. If you enable this parameter, you can also change the saturation of the original base color texture with the curves alpha value. This is controlled with the bottom handles. Let's add the gradient mask layer to this mountain as well. There's an engine bug when changing the curve asset. You need to disable and re-enable the parameter to force it to update. Let's tweak this other mountain as well. All right, that will do it. The next two features I want to show you are the smart material options. If you don't want to use erosion maps, maybe because you do sculpting by hand or have mountains from other sources, you can use these to automatically generate cliffs and snow. To enable, open the Choose on Layers blend section, and in the Layers Fit submenu, instead of picking a numbered editable layer, enable the Auto Cliff option. You can also change the strength and the contrast of the mask in its own submenu. Just keep in mind that by deselecting the numbered layer, the previously used erosion mask no longer affect this layer. If you want to use both, just duplicate this cliff layer and enable the auto cliff option on the new one. Okay, let's put some snow on the mountaintops. And of course, these are just mask generators, so you can use them for any type of layers you like, for example, gravel or grass on the top of the mountains. Alright, next I will show you some advanced material features. If you want to make a flat material have more depth, but Nanite Displacement has a too high performance impact, then material-based context shadows are a great middle ground option. Basically, it makes the surface cast superfine shadows as if it had geometry. Also, if you go to a specific layers parameters, in the context shadow submenu, you will find options to control the shadow casting of that specific layer. Let's increase the shadows of the grassy rock. The system uses the regular contact shadows from your light source, so make sure to enable it with a good value. The next feature is runtime virtual texturing. This is amazing for optimization. It basically makes your material run for a fraction of a performance cost. Make sure to enable it in the project settings first, then create a new volume. Link it to your landscape and to a virtual texture file, then set the bound so that it covers your whole landscape. If you want to use context shadows or Nanite displacement, then you need to create a secondary volume for the displacement texture. Select the landscape, scroll down a bit, and link it to the same virtual textures you are writing with the volumes. And finally, open your material instance and enable it there as well. Make sure that it is also using the same virtual texture assets as the rest. There you go. As you can see, the shader complexity is reduced drastically. Since we are baking out the material to a texture, dynamic and view-dependent features aren't trivial to use. Luckily, UML supports both the distant texture and the fuzzy shading features even with RVT. The distant textures switch automatically, but you control the fade distance with a different parameter. For fuzzy shading, disable the regular one first, then switch to the Details tab and enable the RVT version there. You just need to pick which layers you want to be affected. Lastly, the feature that might be the most exciting is Nanite Displacement. It's quite demanding in terms of performance, but it has a huge visual impact. First, make sure that you have enabled it in your project config file using these two commands. Then select your landscape, enable it there as well, and click Build. Depending on your machine and the resolution of your landscape, this might take a couple of minutes. Keep in mind that anytime you modify the geometry of your landscape, you need to click Rebuild. It seems that the grass layer's displacement is way too strong, so let's open up the material and tweak its values there. Let's take a look at the rocky grass as well. And tweak the cliff layer. Don't worry about the shadow artifacts, it's caused by the virtual shadow maps not getting refreshed by the material changes, so we just need to force it by moving the camera or turning the lights on and off. Or you can temporarily switch to cascade shadow maps in the project settings. If displacement causes issues somewhere or you just don't like it there, you can remove it locally by painting it out. For this, you just need to enable the displacement remover layer in the landscape paint tab. Alright, I'm happy with this for now. I really hope that we can see some performance improvements from Epic in the future, because Nanite Displacement is truly a spectacular feature. So that's it for now. I hope you found this walkthrough useful. If you have any suggestion or feedback about the video or UML, feel free to leave a comment below or start a thread on our subreddit. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe for more content, and see you in the next one.